ce știm noi din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și scut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcuri de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut.
Să
костяк, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И он продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. And we begin tonight's live stream with a very important announcement. The Saviour has arrived. He has risen from the streets of Manchester in the trendy combination of a suit jacket and a t-shirt to rule over all of the left. He is, of course, King Andrew the Last, who has come to us at this time of crisis to revive the Labour Party. Lord be praised. All of the factions are rallying together. You have the dead-ender Blairites. You have the dead-ender remaining Labour left. You have the ever-hopeful Corbyn fanatics who were waiting for the return of their prophet from the wilderness. Will King Andrew invite the grey-haired allotment dweller back in? Will he be allowed to sell his cucumber jam at the Labour conference again? All of these questions are now on the table, for he has promised an end to trickle-down economics. Lord be praised, or should I say Keynes be praised. And now he will proceed to resurrect the Labour Party. It will no longer be a stinking corpse laid out on the butcher's slab, but a confident non-gender specific individual striding forward into a boldly social democratic future. Or so I would say if I had ingested a large amount of paint thinner and actually believed such things. But yes, before we get to the subject at hand, I would be remiss in my duty to you if I did not begin this show with an announcement that St. Andrew of Manchester has, of course, returned to Parliament and threatens to defenestrate Sir Keir Starmer, who has now been officially told to fuck off by his own cabinet and is considering his position, meaning he's waiting for an offer. Basically, the decision has been made, and I'll talk a little bit about this before I do a specific Burnham video, because Burnham is a interesting figure, a con man, of course, of epic proportions, and a man whose reputation as the great renewal artist for social democracy depends upon you never paying any attention to anything he's done in office ever. But so I will be going into specifics about St. Andrew either tomorrow or the day after in a specific video. But just to say a couple of things about British politics, I mentioned some of this on the previous video that went out live for Decline and Fall. We were dealing with the Keir Starmer arson case. But there's clearly a shifting of the sands going on in bourgeois politics in Britain at the moment with the defenestration of Sir Keir Starmer. He's fucked, to use a line from a popular comedy, he's fucked like Caligula's favourite watermelon. It's over for him. It's just a matter of time as to like when he goes and how much damage he chooses to cause on the way out. I think if he's told that he'll be afforded a safe job, maybe, I don't know, UN ambassador or ambassador to NATO or something like that, some job that enables him to twat about and look important but actually means nothing, that will be probably enough to buy him off, or a nice spot on the red benches of the House of Lords where he can soak in port and lemon all day and periodically just collapse on the red benches in a nasty fit of gout and apoplexy. So Sir Keir is done, but more than that, I think there's other things going on as well. The concerted PR campaign around Andy Burnham is reminiscent really of the PR campaigns around figures like David Cameron from 20 years ago, when it was decided by really the sort of Guardian reading, New Statesman humping types in the media circles of London under the influence of the think tank world that the Tories needed their own Tony Blair, and they found one in David Cameron, and there was a specific media campaign that was developed around him to make him look like all things to all men, and of course non-gender specific people. And he was brought in on this sort of shower of PR and proved to be just a bog standard Tory politician, which means he's a bog standard establishment politician. Now, there are some in the more, shall we say, intelligent parts of the bourgeoisie and their strategists who have realized that they've got a bit of a problem at the moment. And they've got a bit of a problem with regard to the Labour Party and the Tories in that they're both dying on their arse. And whereas some in the bourgeoisie might be enthusiastic about like a Rupert Lowe-led government or a Nigel Farage-led government, at the moment, then it's not really in the interest of the ruling class to have either of those two anywhere near a government. Not right now. And also neither of those two capable enough of being like the fascist leaders that would be needed in a real crisis. So there's been a decision, or a sort of consensus has emerged, I think, that they're going to try and reinvigorate the Labour Party and the Tories, because the Labour Party's done a very good job for the ruling class over 100 years now. They have successfully constrained the labour movement, which is a big concern for the ruling class. One of the big reasons why they adapted themselves to having the Labour Party as their second 11, politically speaking, was that the Labour Party brought with it this relationship with the union movement, and to be honest, most of the wider left wing, including the old Communist Party, and most of the Trotskyist parties as well. Labour Party brought with it the ability to control all of them. And with the trade unions, it was a matter of the summits of the unions and the leaders of the Labour Party having a quiet conversation behind closed doors, various incentives being offered, threats being made. And most of the trade union leaders get bought off for a paltry sum. Just look at the amount that old Dave Ward of the Communication Workers Union went for. He went for a gong from the Queen and a possible spot in the House of Lords in the future. If you're watching, Dave, that's for you. Now, the Labour Party's done a very good job constraining working class militancy, leading the working class down blind alley after blind alley for 100 years, essentially. And the ruling class aren't quite ready to give that up. Now, there are potential replacements out there, of course. There are the Greens, and they could attract a certain amount of the social democratic petty bourgeois vote. There's, of course, the Reform gang, who have tried to pitch themselves specifically at the working class, and this has not worked as much as they would have liked. So there's no real replacement for the Labour Party, because what the Labour Party did in its high period, and even to quite recently, was that it brought together a considerable working class vote, with Labour aristocratic votes and radicalized, pseudo-radical, petty bourgeois types into its ranks, into its voting base, and essentially nullified them as a political force and just put them behind the Labour Party. And that was a very powerful thing for the ruling class to have at their disposal, and none of the replacements really have measured up to that. So they want to keep the system going. So they need to revive Labour. Keir Starmer can't do that. He has all the charisma of an empty pair of unused socks and can't manage the job that's in front of him. So they needed Andy Burnham, a man who's a better retail politician who can explain things with a little bit more pizzazz, should we say. So they're bringing him in to revive the Labour Party, to save the link with the unions, which Starmer was just pissing all over. So having the unions linked to the Labour Party is very useful to the ruling class, because it essentially plays a big role in nullifying them as potential sources of resistance, or at least keeping them under control. Worked very well for many years. And also to making sure that nothing really dangerous develops to the left of the Labour Party. You need a plausible leader for this to work. And so you put in somebody who plays the left-wing card, who has a background that's not, at least not from London and the southeast, who appears to be a bit more normal. Not that you could get much less normal than Keir Starmer, and isn't a merchant banker, such as Rishi Sunak or somebody like that. So he's good on that level, and it will be useful for them to have. He will go to the TUC, he will shake everybody's hand, he will tell them all that they're really important, and that he wants a partnership with them. He will not always be able to say yes, but my God, he'll always listen, and that will be enough at the moment to bring the likes of Sharon Graham and etc. and the Unison leadership, the GMB leadership. It'll not be enough to bring them on side. Be enough to stop all the talk of disaffiliation in some of the other unions as well for a while. And it'll also, given that the next election is now already being pitched as the battle against fascism, Cable Street Part, whatever it is, defeat Nasty Nigel and his gang of racists, if Nigel Farage even lasts that long. And what they'll attempt to do is re-rally basically the entirety of the working class vote that might have voted Labour in the past, and the progressive petty bourgeois vote behind Labour again. And at the same time, they need to revive the Tories, because the Tories also do a very important job in that the Tories bring together, or used to be able to bring together, all kinds of frothing lunatic reactionaries under a leader who could then pander to them every now and again and basically give them something symbolic every now and again to get excited about. And as Neil Kinnock said once, in a moment that gave away far more of the truth than he intended, he was talking about how he viewed parliamentary democracy as being inseparable from the Labour and the Tory party taking it in turns, because that's how all these people see bourgeois politics. It's just a game, basically. So there's going to be an attempt to revive the Tories and sink Reform. Reform were a sort of split away from the Tories, really, who were there basically. Farage was brought in at the 2024 election, I think partially to make sure the Tories lost big. And again, there will be various different reasons why that was done. But remember, Farage was retired. He was out of the game until suddenly he was persuaded to come back again. And a lot of resources in terms of media coverage and advertising were put behind Reform. Whereas if they'd have been led by Richard Tice, which they were, they would have gone nowhere. And the Tories wouldn't have lost half as badly as they did in 2024 were it not for that Reform vote. So Reform are now, I think, having the air let out of their tires. You can see this. This is why you should still read the bourgeois press from time to time, because you can see what they're planning to do. So you have headlines and opinion columns in the Daily Telegraph, like the most sort of frothing, mad broadsheet newspaper read by like retired colonels, people who run mercenary companies and stockbrokers, and sometimes that's all the same person. They put this out the other day that Reform were finished. They were never going to be able to form a government. And now there's talk of like, well, Farage should really basically just fuck off and retire, essentially. And the feeling I'm getting from that is that Nigel had his chance and they can't pull it together. They will not be able to pull together what the bourgeoisie wants at this stage, which is a credible opposition movement. There's too many lunatics, foaming lunatics, for the more sensible British bourgeois in the Reform Party, even though Nigel has been very accommodating by changing all his positions from what they were 10 years ago, becoming like rabidly in favour of the war on Russia, becoming rabidly in favour of war in Iran, whilst remaining anti-immigrant, of course, despite supporting all the wars that will create millions of new refugees. But there you go. It's never supposed to make any sense. So the Reform bubble, I think, is being pricked. It's about to burst. And what you'll generally find is then a concerted attempt to push those people back into the Tory party. Now, what will also happen over the next few years is that either Starmer in his last few weeks or Burnham will not formally cancel Brexit. That would generate too much opposition. What will happen is that there will continue to be a series of administrative changes which render Brexit a brino, Brexit in name only. And the Tories will, of course, thunderously denounce this in the most vociferous terms. You'll see Kemi Badenoch or whoever replaces her all over the news shaking his or her fist and declaring, "We will not tolerate this. The votes of the British people are being disregarded," etc., etc. A lot of like fulminating newspaper columns will be written. Tory MPs will be all over the press screaming. There'll be perhaps protests, all of which will be designed to push all those Reform people back to what the ruling class regards as their natural home, which is the Tory party. By the way, the Tory party just won a by-election up in Aberdeen South, basically based on just going up there and proclaiming that if you elect us, we will revive North Sea oil, which successive governments, including governments led by the Tories, allowed to wither away because basically they wouldn't do state-led investment, and the oil companies are so parasitic and useless that they refuse to invest because the profit margins aren't high enough, because they argue that there's too much regulation. But the Tories ran specifically on, we will revive North Sea oil. And in Aberdeen, which has really suffered because of the decline of the oil industry, that was a huge vote winner, and the Tories won a seat previously been a safe SNP seat. So Tories now won their first by-election in Scotland since 1967. So the reform moment, I think, is over. I think it's done. I think they were brought in, they were bigged up for the specific reason of making sure that the Tories lost big. Their job is now done, and the ruling class doesn't want to see the Tories relegated completely. They want to bring them back in, and they want to restabilize the system, which is why they need credible leaders for both of these parties. It's why they need to let the air out of the tires of reform, which they will, because now all they need to do to kill off reform, basically, is just leak all the scandals. And there'll be loads. There's Farage is, bung from a crypto billionaire. There'll be all kinds of other skeletons in the closet, which the ruling class and their strategists can just put in the media, like financial scandals, weird sex stuff, the standard stuff that all the MPs are into, and they'll dump it all on old Nigel and others, and then their poll rating will suffer. Farage will probably fuck off and retire soon, and then they'll elect some clown to replace him who's nowhere near as good a media performer, and their opinion poll rating will fucking crater. And what the ruling class hopes is that Tories will revive. Some of it will go to Rupert Lowe's gang, who are more nakedly fascistic. Most of it will go to a revived Tory party, which will proclaim itself to be a defender of Brexit against Andy Burnham's vicious socialist attempts to pull us back into the communist nightmare of the European Union, etc., etc. So that's where it's probably going to go. I will do a specific video on St. Andrew of Manchester, because he ain't no saint. He was a Metro Mayor for many, many years. If you know anything about the Metro Mayor system in England, it is a corrupt fucking mess. And he and others who have filled those offices have overseen some very shady stuff, which no man receiving this amount of positive press coverage in the capitalist media, such as Andy Burnham is right now, has not got a big amount of skeletons in the closet, shall we say, politically speaking. So yes, more on Andy Burnham in the weeks to come. I think Keir Starmer will be made an offer quite soon to defenestrate himself and slide off to cultivate his gout on the benches of the House of Lords. So we move now to the item at hand, which is, of course, connected to all of this, which is the question of British defence spending. Oh, what a charming story this is. But before we get to any of that, I will make sure that I will remind you all to like and share the stream. Be sure to subscribe to us on Rumble and Twitch and YouTube, and follow us on X and on Substack, of course. Going to be working out some exclusive Substack content pretty soon, so be sure to follow me on there. But and if you're on YouTube, be sure that you've subscribed and, of course, properly clicked on the notification button. So select all notifications on there, because if you don't select the right one, it won't let you know when the stream starts or when the video uploads. So let's have a look and see who is with us in the chat tonight. We have Angry Prole. Would I be able to discuss Juneteenth in the US? I'll certainly add it to the list. Hello to Mogman Dog. Hello to Wicked Witch of the Southeast. Hello to Tim Gray. Hello to Jerry. Hello to James Graham and Paul McCord. Good evening to you. Speedy Bozo, and who else we got here? Spacalos on Twitch, Bruce Albert, Christopher Rogers back in China after being in Wales, Anthony McKeown from a broiling Prague, Alexander from a not ice cold, but soggy Glasgow. So summer in Scotland basically amounts to about 5 days in early June where it's mildly warm. Then we just get rain. It's what makes the agricultural land so wonderfully productive. And who else have we got here? We have Perfidious Joe. We have Alex Moore in Fife. We have David King, who compares Andy Burnham to Macron. I mean, that's a bit unfair to Macron. I mean, for all that Emmanuel Macron is a slimy little bastard who I would not trust as far as I could chuck him. Andy Burnham is a Lego man. Go and look at the old Lego Technic men, if you're familiar with Lego Technic, who have got the plastic hair that you can take off, and there's a little button underneath which the hair plugs onto. Andy Burnham looks like one of them. He looks even less human than Emmanuel Macron. Hello to ACDT. Hello to Rami237. The EU is communist. Ha ha ha. Hey, I have heard that argument. It's been slurred at me by an Ulster fascist many years ago. Many years ago now. How long ago? 12 years ago, 2014. I was out doing a stall with my former comrades in Spew, charmingly named party, proving that the people who founded it had no sense of humour. And we were confronted by some charming, drunk Ulster fascist types who were in town for some kind of Orange Order convention. And this guy comes up to me and he says, you want to take us into that communist EU? That's a communist conspiracy. But more slurry and sort of spitting bits of Burger King as he sort of babbled at me. There's a lot of them out there, like right-wing types, who believe that. Libertarians believe that. The ultra-reactionary fascistic types believe that, because they associate communism just with a big bureaucracy. And because the EU's got a big bureaucracy, it's communism. There's no more. Oh, and there's other stuff in it about social liberalism, which they can't stand, and so it must be communist. They're not the most intelligent bunch, to be honest. Right. So, hello to everybody out there. Again, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. We're going to get into the spectacle here of the John Healey resignation, which seems like a long time ago now. But John Healey, former was resigned and followed out of office by his foul mini-me, a gentleman by the name of Al Carnes. So I'm going to be taking a look at this tonight. So Healey resigned, demanding that more money be spent on defence. And what I'm going to be exploring tonight is why all of this is a farce. So let's get going with this one then. So the resignation of John Healey as Secretary of State for Defence has occasioned a predictable spectacle. Retired military figures such as Admiral West have taken to the airwaves demanding increased military spending and cuts to other public services, essentially arguing for the very policy that prompted Healey's departure. The choreography is transparent. A minister resigns, ostensibly over insufficient funding, and the military-industrial chorus immediately demands what he demanded, but louder. So this is not a policy debate, though. It is a piece of bureaucratic theatre, and its purpose is budget inflation by other means. Now, the central ideological premise of this campaign is a false binary, that Britain faces the choice between funding its military adequately and maintaining public services. This is presented as a tragic necessity, a hard choice imposed in a dangerous world. Now, it's nothing of the sort. And of course, Admiral West was rambling away about this, saying, well, it's all very well providing breakfast for children, but then the Russians turn up and they shoot the children and eat the breakfast. Now, what are you going to do then? I'm only slightly exaggerating from the sort of bilious performance of the Admiral himself. If the Admiral wants to, of course, contest this, he's more than welcome to come on the show and state his point of view. Admiral, I'm sure you know where to find me. Now, we moving back to discuss the matter at hand here. So one of the myths about defence spending that's put out there by Keir Starmer, by Andy Burnham, by every politician in the United States is that this is some kind of way of military spending can actually revive an economy. This is untrue and has always been untrue. There was one of the myths about the Nazis was that it was their enormous amount of military spending which secured a relative degree of economic growth. What actually happened was that the economy revived because they were able to essentially increase the rate of exploitation of the working class. in Germany by completely suppressing all forms of working class organization for many years. And that was of course, the primary purpose of the Nazis. And of course, this was overseen by banking insiders like Hjalmar Schacht. Now, what actually happened with Nazi military spending was that it actually, by the end of the 1930s, the German economy was rapidly destabilizing. The military spending was unbalancing it. And so this is one of the reasons why there was a ticking clock under Hitler, so to speak, that pushed him to launch the war when he did. Because if he'd hung around much longer, then the economy would have gone south quickly. They had to go to war with the Poles when they did. They had to launch the war of conquest because it was really the only way that they were going to be able to get out of the desperate straits they were going to be in if they'd retained they retained the peace much longer. That's a separate issue. But the point is, the idea of military Keynesianism is a falsehood because the arms economy functions as a specific form of unproductive expenditure, capital absorption that does not generate surplus value in the productive sense, but serves to stabilize the accumulation process by creating artificial demand and absorbing excess capacity. The Ministry of Defence in this country, or the Pentagon in the United States, does not merely spend money. It operates as a vast mechanism for the socialization of costs and the privatization of profits, channeling public funds into private hands through procurement contracts while delivering remarkably little in terms of actual military capability. This is very true in Britain. It's also true of the United States. If you look at the actual fighting capacity of the US military over the last few decades, it's gone down and down and down, whereas the amount that's spent is ever spiraling upwards. So in British terms, the National Audit Office has consistently documented this dysfunction. The Ministry of Defence's 2023 to 2033 equipment plan was judged by the National Audit Office to be unaffordable to the tune of £16.9 billion, with the department basing its planning on the assumption that defence spending would increase to 2.5% of gross domestic product, a figure for which no schedule existed at the time. Of 47 major Ministry of Defence projects in the government major projects portfolio, 12 were rated red, that is unachievable, 27 amber, which is significant concerns, and only 3 were rated as being green, meaning on track. The F-35 jet program alone has consumed £11 billion, with what the National Audit Office described as a disappointing return compared to Ministry of Defence plans. The nuclear missile program and submarine program has seen costs rise by approximately £10 billion, driven by a combination of the department trying to speed up the work schedule and adding new programs to it and the rate of inflation. This is not a department in terms of the Ministry of Defence that is starved of resources. It is a department that absorbs resources with the efficiency of a black hole, transforming public money into private profit through a labyrinth of private finance initiative schemes, cost-plus contracts, and bureaucratic self-perpetuation. The choice between defence and public spending is false because the Ministry of Defence does not need more money. What it needs, if you judge this by the amount spent, is less waste, less corruption, and less ideological capture by the arms industry. Now, of course, nobody who is talking about increasing defence spending is going to address any of these issues because the defence spending that goes on right now and will continue to be the same way, this is a grift. This is a profit-generating scam. Their money will go in, profit will come out, and the ability of the British Armed Forces to actually fight a war against a serious country will remain the same. Zero. So moving on from the corruption and the waste angle, which is important in and of itself, let's talk about what the Admiral Wests of the world are demanding in terms of increased spending is addressing something which is structurally impossible, and that is the fact that they can't actually remilitarize in the way that they're demanding. So the deeper truth, which Admiral Wests of the world can't see or refuse to acknowledge, is that Britain can't remilitarize on the scale they imagine, regardless of budget allocations. This is not a matter of political will, but of structural incapacity, the consequence of 4 decades of deindustrialization and financialization that have hollowed out the British productive base. The British state's attempts to build 6 new munitions factories and procure 7,000 long-range weapons, while creating a mere 1,800 jobs, is illustrative. During World War II, Britain produced 83,000 tanks, 115,000 heavy guns, 90,000 aircraft, and nearly 7 billion rounds of small arms ammunition. This was achieved through the total mobilization of an industrial economy that simply no longer exists. The very language of the Strategic Defence Review conducted recently, talking about defence spending as a, quote, engine for growth, or creating sovereign supply chains or digital transformation processes, reveals the desperation of a state attempting to conjure industrial capacity through press releases and innovation funds. As Samir Amin argued in his analysis of peripheral capitalism, the deindustrialization of the imperial core is not a reversible policy choice, but a structural feature of the globalized division of labor. Britain's transition to a rentier economy, dependent on financial services, property speculation, and the extraction of surplus from the global south, has destroyed the industrial manufacturing infrastructure that would make serious war production possible. The Ministry of Defence can announce £400 million in innovation funds and so-called always-on munitions pipelines, but it can't recreate the steelworks, the engineering capacity, or the skilled workforce that once made war production in Britain a material reality on the scale that the Admiral Wests of the world are now demanding. Now, the Russian Federation, for all its limitations, retains a substantially more integrated industrial base than Britain does. This is not to idealize Russian capitalism, which remains dependent on raw material exports and suffers from the catastrophic legacy of the 90s counter-revolution, but the asymmetry is stark. Russia can produce artillery shells, tanks, and missiles at scale because it retains strong elements of the planned industrial infrastructure that was built up during the Soviet period. Britain has deliberately dismantled its industrial infrastructure. The idea that Britain could match Russian capacity through innovation and digital targeting webs is a fantasy, which is dressed up in military jargon. Now, Lenin, of course, talked about this at length. The structural impossibility of British remilitarization is not merely a contemporary policy failure, but it is an expression of what Lenin identified as the defining tendency of imperialism, the transformation of industrial capitalism into a parasitic rentier economy. In his work, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, in Chapter 8, entitled Parasitism and Decay of Capitalism, Lenin observed that the export of capital, one of the most essential economic bases of imperialism, still more completely isolates the rentiers from production and sets the seal of parasitism on the whole country that lives by exploiting the labour of several overseas countries and colonies. Lenin was explicit about the British case specifically. He cited the bourgeois German economist of the time, Schultz-Gavenitz, and he quoted from Schultz-Gavenitz's work with approval and noted, quote, Great Britain is gradually becoming transformed from an industrial centre into a creditor state. Notwithstanding the absolute increase in industrial output and the export of manufactured goods, there is an increase in the relative importance of income from interest and dividends, issues of securities, commissions and speculation from the whole of the national economy. In my opinion, it is precisely this that forms the economic basis of imperialist ascendancy. The creditor is more firmly attached to the debtor than the seller is to the buyer. This was from 1916. A century later, the transformation is complete. Britain is no longer gradually becoming a creditor state. It is a rentier state par excellence, with financial services contributing over 8% to GDP and the City of London functioning as a global clearinghouse for speculative capital rather than a centre of industrial production. The absolute increase in industrial output that Schultz-Gavenitz's noted has long since reversed into absolute decline. Lenin further quoted the English liberal intellectual J.A. Hobson, who warned that unless counteracted, imperialist forces would lead to a condition where, quote, the greater part of Western Europe might then assume the appearance and character already exhibited by tracts of country in the south of England, in the Riviera, and in the tourist-ridden or residential parts of Italy and Switzerland. Little clusters of wealthy aristocrats drawing dividends and pensions from the Far East, and a somewhat larger group of professional retainers and tradesmen and a larger body of personal servants and workers in the transport trade, and in the final stages of production of the more perishable goods. All the main arterial industries would have disappeared, the staple foods and manufactures flowing in as tribute from Asia and Africa. Unquote. Hobson's prospect, which Lenin endorsed as the logical trajectory of imperialism, has been realised in contemporary Britain with precision. The steelworks of Sheffield, the shipyards of the Clyde and the Tyne, the textile mills of Lancashire, the engineering capacity of the Midlands, all gone, not by enemy action, but by the deliberate choices of a ruling class that found greater returns in financial speculation than in productive investment. The Ministry of Defence's announcement that it will build 6 new munitions factories to produce 7,000 weapons is a pathetic echo of the industrial capacity that once made Britain a military power. Lenin's analysis of the tendency to stagnation and decay is equally pertinent. He argued that monopoly capitalism, quote, inevitably engenders a tendency of stagnation and decay. Since monopoly prices are established, even temporarily, the motive cause of technical and consequently of all other progress disappears to a certain extent. Unquote. The British arms industry exemplifies this tendency perfectly. The Ministry of Defence's procurement system is not a competitive market, but a monopoly, dominated by a handful of major contractors such as BAE Systems, Rolls-Royce and Babcock, whose profits are guaranteed by cost-plus contracts and PFI schemes regardless of performance. The result is the National Audit Office documented dysfunction, £16.9 billion of unaffordable equipment plans, 12 of 47 major projects rated unachievable, 11 billion for the F-35, and the nuclear program costing or rising costs by 10 billion. These are not accidents. These are the systematic consequences of monopoly procurement in a parasitic economy. The rentier state is not merely an economic category, but a political one. Lenin noted that the rentier state is a state of parasitic decay in capitalism, and this circumstance cannot fail to influence all the socio-political conditions of the countries concerned. The political expression of this decay is precisely the spectacle we now witness. Retired military figures demand ever greater spending for a military apparatus that the productive base of the economy cannot sustain, while the actual industrial capacity for war production has been systematically dismantled. Admiral West and his colleagues are not strategists but rentiers of a different sort, living off the ideological dividends of a Cold War that ended 3 decades ago, clipping coupons for a threat that exists only in their rhetoric. Lenin recorded the statistical evidence of British industrial decline even in his own time, when he noted that the total number of British workers employed productively was declining from 23% of the population in 1851 to 15% in 1901. If this trend was visible to Lenin in 1916, it is, in its completion, undeniable to us today. The percentage of the British population employed in productive industry has fallen to single digits. The productively employed population has been replaced by a vast service sector, a financial sector and a state bureaucracy that absorbs wealth without producing it. The Ministry of Defence's £52.7 billion budget, rising to £73.5 billion, is not an investment in military capacity, but a transfer payment to a parasitic complex of arms manufacturers, consultants and retired officers, a modern form of the tribute from Africa and Asia that Hobson anticipated, except the tribute is now extracted in part from the British working class through taxation and austerity. The demand for cuts to public services to fund military expansion is thus revealed in its true light, not a tragic necessity imposed by external threat, but the internal logic of a rentier state in terminal decay. The British ruling class cannot restore industrial capacity because it destroyed it deliberately. It cannot generate the surplus for war production because it extracts what surplus remains through financial speculation. And it cannot acknowledge these structural impossibilities because to do so would be to acknowledge that imperialism has entered a terminal phase. The Russian threat is the necessary fiction that sustains the illusion of British military relevance, just as the export of capital and colonial tribute once sustained the illusion of British industrial supremacy. As Lenin noted, quote, imperialism is the eve of the social revolution of the proletariat, unquote. The decay of British imperialism is not a reversible policy failure, but the unfolding of the contradiction Lenin identified over a century ago. The question is not whether Britain can afford the war its military bureaucracy demands, but whether it can afford the military bureaucracy itself. And the answer, written in the ruins of British industry and the ledges of the City of London, is no. So now we get to the Russian threat that Lord West was burbling about and which Paul Mason has been raving about. If you don't believe in Russian threats, then thou art a traitor and vile to mine eyes. He's not that eloquent, of course. He's mainly just raving due to whatever diet pills that he's on, eviscerating his brain matter. Now, the Russian threat and its reality needs to be focused on here. The ideological function of the Russian threat narrative here is to obscure the structural impossibilities we've just been talking about. Admiral West and his colleagues invoke the spectre of the Russian tanks going down the Mall and planting the Russian tricolor over Buckingham Palace, and an image that is so absurd it would be funny if it were not deployed to justify real cuts to healthcare, education, and other vital services. The historical comparison done by West and others reveals a certain bankruptcy of this argument. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact possessed vast military capabilities that at least warranted a serious strategic assessment. The Soviet armed forces numbered in the many millions, supported by an industrial capacity which stretched all the way from Berlin to Vladivostok. The political threat was always exaggerated. The Soviet leadership, for all of its periodic bellicose announcements under leaders like Khrushchev, was fundamentally always seeking a negotiated accommodation with the imperialist powers that would secure its interests and reduce defense burdens. This was the logic, the dreadful logic, that ultimately produced the Gorbachev counter-revolution. But the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact's military capabilities were very real and posed a real threat to the imperialists. The Russian Federation of today, the capitalist Russian Federation, is not the Soviet Union. There is no Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact's nations are mostly absorbed in NATO now. The modern-day Russian Federation has less than half the population of the Soviet Union. Its industrial base has not recovered really from the devastation of the 90s and the restoration of capitalism. Its military doctrine, as demonstrated in the Ukraine war, prioritizes limited territorial objectives and defensive operations and is not set up quite deliberately for expeditionary warfare, because Russia is not the aggressive imperialist power that the fantasists like Paul Mason claim that it is. The idea that capitalist Russia could launch or would launch a conventional invasion of Western Europe that would enable them to reach Britain is strategically illiterate. It's a fantasy sustained only by the ideological needs of a military bureaucracy desperate to justify its existence. As Nikos Poulantzas argued in his analysis of the capitalist state, the military apparatus possesses a specific relative autonomy that allows it to develop interests that are sometimes distinct from those of the ruling class. The British military hierarchy is not simply executing ruling class policy. It is engaged in a bureaucratic struggle for resources and institutional survival, using the only ideological currency available to it, that of the external threat. The Russian threat is not an assessment of strategic reality, but a discursive technology for budget expansion. So the political analysis here is equally misguided. The Russian leadership under Putin operates, as we've covered before in our four-part Russia series, which you should go and watch if you haven't done so already. The Putin system is a classical Bonapartist system, mediating between competing class fractions such as comprador liberals, national bourgeois elements, and the military security apparatus, while maintaining the overall framework of capitalist restoration. As Poulantzas noted, Bonapartism emerges when the class struggle reaches an equilibrium of forces that threatens the stability of the state itself, requiring a strong state to maintain the conditions of capitalist accumulation. This is exactly what Putinism is, if it is anything. Crucially, this Bonapartist system in Russia has no interest in territorial expansion into Western Europe. Putin's Russia for decades sought integration into the US-led global order. Some in that system still do. They were represented by a certain Mr. Kirill Dmitriev, a vile individual who I could do an hour on just calling him names. Maybe I will. Now, but the crucial thing about Russia is that the Putin system did not and could not accept entry into the US-led system as a subordinated periphery, but really they wanted into the system as a negotiated partner with recognized spheres of influence. The entire trajectory of Russian foreign policy since 1991 has been integrationist, seeking World Trade Organization membership, the Partnership for Peace, and eventually the Greater Europe concept that would accommodate Russian capital within Western institutional frameworks. The conflict with the US and the British is not ideological. Putin is still a liberal politician fundamentally, but positional. The US and its allies demand total subordination, a Yeltsin-type comprador state, while the Russian leadership sought terms that would protect certain national interests and certain class interests. This is transparent to any serious strategic assessment done by London or Washington. They know this. The Russian threat is not believed by most of those who propagate it, except those who are so far gone on various toxic substances that they've lost all ability to reason, such as Paul Mason. It is really functional, a necessary fiction for a military bureaucracy that has lost its Cold War purpose and a political class that no longer possesses an industrial base. The retired admirals and generals who populate television studios are not analysts, but ideological state spokesmen in the Althusarian sense, performing a scripted function in the reproduction of capitalist social relations. Now, here we get to examining Healey's resignation as a bureaucratic maneuver. So, the resignation of Healey and Carnes and the subsequent media campaign revealed the mechanics of what we might call threat inflation, the systematic exaggeration of external dangers to justify internal resource allocation. This is not unique to Britain. It is a feature of all late imperialist states facing the same contradiction between global military commitments and declining productive capacity. John Healey, as Secretary of Defence, was not resisting this logic but embodying it. His resignation was a performance of principled concern, so-called, designed to strengthen the very position he ostensibly opposed. As all defence secretaries who remain in post for more than a year inevitably discover, the Ministry of Defence is not a department of state, but a provider of contracts for the arms industry, captured by procurement interests that transcend any individual minister's authority. The revolving door between the MOD and the arms industry and the military hierarchy ensures that this policy is made by those who profit from it, regardless of which party holds office. The demand for cuts to public spending to fund military expansion is thus doubly cynical. It proposes to sacrifice the remaining elements of social reproduction, health spending, education, welfare, etc., to fund a military apparatus that cannot deliver the capabilities it promises, through procurement processes that systematically waste the money they absorb. This is not defence. It is a looting of public resources under the cover of so-called patriotic necessity. Now, the spectacle of retired British military figures demanding ever greater military spending while the British state lacks the industrial capacity to produce the weapons they imagine is a symptom of imperial decay. It is the political equivalent of a fading aristocracy demanding the restoration of privileges that the material base of their power can no longer sustain. As Giovanni Arrighi argued in his analysis of systemic cycles of accumulation, the transition from productive to financial hegemony marks the terminal phase of imperial power's life cycle. Britain's transition from the workshop of the world to a rentier economy, dependent on financial services and property speculation, is not a reversible policy choice, but a structural transformation that has destroyed the foundations of military power. The British state can spend billions on nuclear submarines and digital targeting webs, but it cannot recreate the industrial civilization that once made Britain a huge force in terms of its ability to project power out into the world. We must all reject this absolute nonsense and expose it for what it is, a wretched fantasy of fading military men desperate to strut about on the world stage again in a way that the hollowed out shell of the British economy in its late stage of imperial rot simply cannot afford. The choice is not between defence and public spending. The choice, in the end, is between rationally planned economics and the continued parasitism of late-stage imperialism. Rationally planned economics can, of course, only mean a transition to socialism. The Russian tanks aren't coming. The real enemy is right here at home, in the City of London, in the ministries of the government in London, in the boardrooms of the big banks and the arms manufacturers, in the television studios where the retired generals and admirals perform their budgetary theatre. It is time we turned our attention to where the real enemy is. So, that concludes my journey through this particular contradictory mess. Just going to catch up on comments in the chat here. Hello to Davey, over there in the wild northwest of Wales. Hello, James Graham. Spacolos says, I assume it's in Chile, where Colonia Dignitat did some horrific experiments where they put the spirits of all deceased Nazis into young Chileans, so you get people like Macron, Varadkar, Buttigieg, Marin, and Callas. Well, if it was that easy to stop the reproduction of leaders, then it would be an easier task for us. But unfortunately, it's a much more prosaic reason why the leaders keep all looking the same and sounding the same. It's because the imperialist system is very rigidly controlled. Right. LC 1810 says, so in a nutshell, privatization diminishes military strength. Deindustrialization diminishes military strength. And the privatization of the war industries basically makes sure that you can't actually fight a war. Remember that in 1940 to 41, the British essentially had to nationalize or take under state management all of the war industries in Britain. Why? Because under the relations of production that were constructed by the private owners, and the way that those plants were managed, they could not and would not produce the requisite amount of war material. The British state had to essentially create a planned economy for the entirety of the war, and basically tell the private owners, well, here's some profits for you, but you can't have any influence over the running of the plants anymore, because they were just run horrendously in a horrendously inefficient fashion. So to actually have the kind of like war fighting capacity that the Admiral Wests of the world pretend that they want, but not really. I don't think Admiral West really wants to see a war with the Russians, because it would be a war that the British state could not win. You would need to essentially take power away from the private owners, which of course they're not going to do. This is all a gigantic cynical grift. And I didn't even get into tonight the psychological warfare aspect of it, because the constant drumming, trying to drum up the Russian threat is also partly a psychological operation aimed at all of us, to convince us of some vast external villain that we need to rally behind the flag in order to defend ourselves against. But I'll repeat this ad nauseum. There will be no Russian tanks on the Mall. I also repeat that regarding what I said earlier on the Decline and Fall show, if Putin really wants London and the southeast of England, he can have it, but I don't think he wants it. Wicked Witch of the Southeast says Lockheed Martin is in talks with GM to do weapons manufacturing. Yeah. David King says corrupt system breeds corruption. Yeah. Hello to Finnish Leica. Spekulos says, no idea why, but the rich kids in Russia, the whole class is called New Russians, developed this disgusting nasal dialect, only they speak. And Kirill Dmitriev is one of those kids who talks like this. Every time he talks, I become aggressive and want to punch and kick him. Well, Spekulos, that's an entirely sensible way to regard Kirill Dmitriev, who is really, he is a personification of like continuity Yeltsinism. And the fact that he has such a high-profile role in the Russian system does not speak well of that system. Hello to Svetlana in Moscow. I'm sure our Russian viewers understand this very well. Now, right. Okay. So, to reiterate the point, there's like the British ruling class are... so Svetlana says, just heard today that our government is planning to have private contractors make rifles and submachine guns. Well, depends upon the conditions of the contract, whether that will be efficient or not. Basically, if you want the private sector to be efficient in terms of production of war material, then again, the state needs to set very strict terms of contract. And if they don't fulfill the contract, then there's measures are taken against them. What happens with the American and the British procurement systems with the military is if they don't deliver, then they just get more money. So I suspect that that move by the Russian government is again a means of funneling war profits to the Russian capitalist class again. And this is the reason why basically, like, the more you examine the Russian system, several things become clear. One is that Russia is not an imperialist country, not even close. Two, the Russian capitalist class are a completely feeble, totally corrupt bunch who, even those who see the sense in defending the country against NATO encroachment, would never want to actually didn't actually want to have this war fought in a way that would lead to the dramatic defeat and collapse of the Kiev regime, because they still want to find a way back into the networks run by the West. They are desperate for a negotiated settlement. The West isn't giving them one so far. Svetlana, you also say new poll says United Russia popularity is down to just 16%. We'll see how the Duma elections go with regard to that. And the other point, point three, is that the Russian military theoretically did have the capability fairly early on, if they'd actually mobilized in a more serious way, to knock out the Kiev regime. Now, if you remember, in those early days of the special military operation, the Russian forces advanced very quickly and the Ukrainian forces fell into disarray quite quickly. Now, what happened was, of course, the Russians hadn't deployed anything like enough men to do things like race on to Odessa and take Kiev. What they hoped was that they would get a negotiation. They got a negotiation, of course, but it was Ukrainians were told by Boris Johnson, acting in concert with and on behalf of the Biden administration, no, you don't want that kind of negotiation. You want to fight to the death. Now, excuse me, I'm back off to London. And thus you get the grinding slaughterhouse of Ukraine over the last 4 years. But it was certainly a possibility that it could have all ended in 2022. But again, the disposition of forces was just not there to do that. To be able to do that, the Russian government would have had to deploy far more men. They would have had to do a call up straight away. And that, again, at each stage, we are reminded again and again of Clausewitz's maxim that war is a continuation of policy by other means. The war waged by the Russian Federation, or the special military operation, as Putin insists on calling it, this reflects the inner contradictions of the Bonapartist system in Russia, which is that Putin and co are desperate to prevent politicization in Russia. They're desperate to prevent, especially, politicization along the lines of class, which is why Lenin's tomb remains covered over during Victory Day celebrations. I find that to be an obscenity. They cover over the very thing, the tomb of the very man who made the victory in 1945 possible. Without Lenin, there is no electrification and industrialization. Without Lenin, there is no Soviet Union. Without Lenin, German imperialism comes back and cannibalizes a Russia run by some white general or the Tsar or something. Svetlana, you observe the KPRF, they aren't communists, far too cozy with the ruling class. In essence, I think that is true. Like Zyuganov and others make some interesting observations, but essentially these are old Brezhnevites who have long since accommodated themselves to being like the loyal opposition to Putin within the Russian system. Apparently quite a number of people are joining the KPRF. I imagine that they will leave again soon, rather disappointed. Now, I hope that a Russian Communist Party can emerge that is stronger, that is able to exist in a more, shall we say, confrontational situation with the Kremlin, or whether that will be possible, or whether the Russian government would try and repress it out of existence is going to be an interesting thing to observe. But certainly there's going to be a lot of men coming out of the Russian armed forces at the end of the special military operation. It will end somehow, very politicized and rather pissed off. Be interesting to see where they go. So I will just do a couple of announcements before drawing to a close for this evening. Tomorrow, got another Q&A on history questions on Patreon. So be sure to tune in for that if you're a subscriber. Also, there will be a Q&A session on Telegram at some point in the next week or so. Seems to be some enthusiasm for that. So basically what I'm going to be doing is I'll be doing like a call-in show on there where I'll be taking questions live from the audience on Telegram. So I'll update as to when that's going to be. Check out the Decline and Fall show from earlier today if you haven't done so already. That was a pre-recorded live video that's up on our YouTube page now. So more Decline and Fall coming for you next week. More videos coming for you next week on St. Andrew of Burnham, for instance, and his schemes, and why I think that the reform bubble is burst. So thank you for joining me tonight. I'll be back with you on Patreon tomorrow, and then we'll be back with you talking about Andy Burnham on Sunday,